I have to be afraid about her introduction, but she was wrong. So we are on O, and I was going to talk about omnipotence and omniscience and omnipresence, but it's already been covered, so I've been over there thinking about orthopedics, orthodontics, I don't know, opium, there's other old words I guess I could go with, but since I've done all this preparation, I guess I'll go ahead. Maybe I'll talk about it a slightly different way, but Jonna set it all up beautifully, of course. Omni comes from all. Everywhere, all things from Latin. And what I want to do is talk about that meaning within the context of the reality of the universe. And I mean the universe as it actually is, not as we perceive it, not as our conventional wisdom tells us, but as it actually is. And as I thought about that, I saw this quote. It was actually in a book on physics, and it was from Through the Looking Glass. And Alice is talking with the Queen, and the Queen has told her to believe in impossible things. And Alice says, well, you can't just choose to believe impossible things. And the Queen said, boy, I don't know about you young people nowadays. When I was young, we always practiced believing in impossible things. Sometimes I'd believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. So I'm going to ask you to believe impossible things, because what I'm going to do is describe the universe to you as it really is by the best scientists in the world, derived from the most precise experiments ever done, and I assure you, it's totally impossible. We live in a universe where the very foundation of it changes constantly. Space and time shrink or expand based on how each individual item is moving, or the gravity field that it's in. So the very foundation that you live within, space and time, constantly shrinks or expands. Beyond that, we know that there are 4 dimensions. There's back and forth, up, down, front, back, in the dimension of time. All equal in, again, the best science we have, relativity theory. Now, I can move my hand, say, from the left to the right. I can move it back again. But when I move it from the left to the left still exists over there, right? In any of the dimensions of space, if you move from one point to the other points still exist. And relativity theory tells us that's true in time. That even though we're moving forward in time, because time is like all other dimensions, it all exists. Which means the past exists right now. It means the future exists right now. Now what that tells you is it's time to just give up on everything. Because everything's already predetermined. If the future already exists, you can't make any choices. You can't create anything. I mean, the best scientific theory around says the future already exists. So what do we do with that? This is where the beauty of it comes in. This is where the strangeness and the magic takes over. Because even though that's true, it isn't that straightforward. You know, science tries to make sense of the universe, as we try to make sense of other people sometimes. It's not always easy to do. If the universe worked perfectly just by a formula, there would be no need for God in any sense. And in fact, in the early Enlightenment, that was the concept. They said, the universe works like a clock. It says it's wound up, but if we knew every detail, we could predict everything that was going to happen because it's all preset. It's a clockwork universe. They said, you know, there may well have been a creator at some point that created the universe, but when that creator, when that God wound it up and set it in motion, it just runs now. There's no need for God. God must have gone off somewhere else. And in many ways, if you look at science, that's what it could look like. Until you start looking at the real details of things. And this is where quantum theory comes in, which again is much stranger than Wonderland, when Alice in Wonderland. We think of that as a very strange place, but it's not nearly as strange as where we live. Science has now shown through precise experiments that things can be in two places at once. They have shown that everything, and I mean electrons, protons, neutrons, atoms, the molecules that make us up, everything is both matter and energy. Now, you can't be both of those things at the same time. Logic tells you that they are exact opposites. Energy is spread over space. Matter is one precise point. You can't be both of them, and yet all of the science shows that that's what everything is. And what makes it even stranger, when science found this, when the scientists, they said, okay, well, what makes it change from one to the other? They couldn't find any factor that determined whether any particular particle was going to be matter or energy, except one factor only, when a consciousness measured it. Only when a person looks at it does it determine whether it's matter or energy. Our very conscious observation of the universe creates it into what it is. But we go way beyond that. We go way beyond that. I'm going to tell you about our experiments, a little detail. I should have a chalkboard up here, but we just have to imagine together. You shoot a beam of light, just a little pulse of light, and it hits what's called a beam splitter. So it splits that pulse of light. And then it's going to go two different ways, right? And they have mirrors to bring it back together. Now, if it goes both ways and comes back together, it creates what's called an interference pattern. So you can tell it went both ways and then came back together. That has to be energy, because only energy as a wave could split both ways, right? But the other option is it only goes one of those ways. Instead of splitting, it just goes one way, it comes back, it hits our target, and you can tell that because it looks different when it hits the target. Okay? Now think this through. You send this pulse of light at this beam splitter. Every time it's going to split and go both ways. They can know that. They've done the measurement over and over. Except if you do this. If you put a detector on that beam splitter so it can tell you if it goes both ways or if it only goes one way, then every time it goes one way. If we measure it as which way it goes, it becomes matter and it will only go one way. Our very measurement changed it from acting like energy, which it always did if it wasn't detected, to acting like matter only because we measured it. Oh, but it's much stranger than that. Because then they did one other thing. I mean, this is the thing. Think it through, it blows you away. They take this detector and they move it down the line. Okay? The beam splitter's here, the detector's down here. Now they make it where the detector goes on randomly. Sometimes it'll go on, sometimes it won't. But it only turns on after the beam hits the splitter. Now we already know that if it's not measured, the beam will split and go both ways. And when the beam hits the splitter, there is no detector turned on. Presumably, it's going to go both ways. If the detector never turns on, we see at the end that it went both ways. But if that detector turns on, even after the split has already occurred, it will always detect it. It will always be a proton and only go one way. How in the world does that happen? How do you have a reality where if you measure something later, it changes what it did beforehand? This is the best science in the world that shows us this. Now, scientists work and work and work to explain this. One of my friends, and I've mentioned this before, is a subatomic particle physicist at Oxford. He tells me that the only explanation for many of these things in quantum theory is the consciousness involved. And he hates that. He's working hard to try to come up with some other explanation. But there isn't any. And I'll tell you this. Science says, take the simplest solution. Occam's razor, or KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Take the simplest solution. Now here we have observations. We have a universe where the foundation of that universe changes based on each individual item, in effect, in the universe. We have a universe where matter and energy exist in quantum states. They exist as probability only. They only take on a reality form when observed by a consciousness. And yet, a magnificent universe has evolved for 14 million years into very complicated stars and planets and life forms. How can you have that very complicated evolution that takes very, very precise development happening only in a quantum state? Or does there have to be a consciousness that observed it? How can you have a situation where a consciousness can change the past? And if the past then changes the present, then the present will change the future. And so even though we live in a universe where the future is already here, we have the ability to change it. And the very simplest, most straightforward explanation I can come up with that is an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, conscious being. And O, when you say A-E-I-O-U, hesitate just a second on O. Because O is one. And we are one individual being. But we also are the oneness. We are the oneness that is the consciousness that's present in all of the universe, and that creates this totally impossible existence and makes it work beautifully.
Yeah.